Welcome. I'm Dr. Greg Hughes and CEO of Viva Concepts. I'm also a co-founder. The subject we'll talk about today is on the subject of hygiene and retention, the most vital area of any practice for long-term practice growth. Without retention, the practice will never grow. Let's take up first a simple review of what makes a business grow. There are only 4 laws or 4 business laws that make any business grow. Those laws are: first, customer acquisition. You will always have to acquire customers for the life of that practice. Without customers, you'll never grow. The database will leak, the patients will go away, and the operatories will empty out. Once you've acquired a customer, the next law is you have to sell that customer, called consumer sales. For you in a dental office, it's called treatment plan acceptance or case acceptance. The next law, you've now acquired them, you've now sold them something. They now go into the third law, which is called consumer retention. For you, it would be called recall or recare. That law is the most important law by a factor of 10 over all 4 laws. The last law is called a positive experience, which is pretty innately known by everybody. You have to have a high care factor. You have to have a good ambience with your patient. You have to have a good dialogue with them. Your patients will have a perception of how much do you care about them. That's known inherently by yourself. If your staff have it, then you're a 10. Those 4 laws combined do one thing for a practice. They grow the size of the active database. For you, it's called a patient base, or your active patients, or a combination of your active and inactive patients. That number itself is going to be defined very precisely, because currently in our profession, if I were to ask you, what is your active patient count? The office manager, the doctor, or any staff member will look and go, I don't know, it's about 500, it's about 800. Whatever it happens to be, what is your definition that you've been given for the active patient count in your office? You'll see where this is going in a moment, because that number is the most critical number for your growth. So let's take a look at an office, and let's take a look at what happens to it over a period of 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, or 20 years. An office grows, it has 20, 30 patients a month. So let's do some really simple math here. Let's take an office that's doing 30 to 35 patients a month, or 40 patients a month. 40 patients a month, 12 months out of the year, is about 480 patients a year. So let's round it off to 500. So a practice getting 500 patients a year, let's say that it's been around for about 20 years. Well, 20 years times 500 is about 10,000 patients that should be in that database. So after 20 years, you'll have 10,000 patients. So now let's take a look at what the real active number is. How do you define or get a proper definition of the active database? Currently, the definition that we have from our industry, whether it's on the website from Henry Schein, the American Dental Association, or your local state association, the definition you will have is if a patient has come in the last 18 to 24 months, they're considered active. Well, let's evaluate that definition, because that definition for your practice is actually a disaster. Why is that? Well, let's flip over to the consumer. The consumer are the people on the street. Let's go ask the consumers on the street how often they should go to a dentist. And from age 5 to 85, every person you interview will tell you that the average person should come in twice a year or once every 6 months. Now, that's a correct definition. Now, how did they get that definition? That definition came about from 50 years of advertising from Procter & Gamble. Crest toothpaste, Scope mouthwash, dental floss, and you name it. The ADA and your local state association, the hygiene industry, began to jump on board, but the real revenue-driven advertising to the consumer came from Procter & Gamble. So that being said, your consumer now knows a proper definition of an active consumer, which means they're coming into your office twice a year. So let's take a look and give you a new definition. Let's take the whiteboard that you have on any definitions that you have earlier of what is an active patient count in your office. If it was 18 months, if it's 24 months or 12 months, let's erase the board and let's give you a new definition before we start. That definition is real simple, and we'll demonstrate this in a moment. The actual definition is the number of hygiene recall visits divided by 2. So let's take a look at that definition and where it comes from. If a patient comes in twice a year, we can take a look at the actual active consumer count by simply counting the number of hygiene days that you have in your office. So let's say you have 5 days a week. 5 days a week of hygiene is how many active patients in a year? Well, the average hygienist across the country sees about 8 patients a day. So if you have 8 patients a day times 5 days a week, that's 40 patients a week. There's 50 working weeks in a year. So 50 times 40 patients in a week equals about 2,000 patients. So that's 2,000 patients. Those are the recall patients we have that are actually being seen by the office. Regardless if you have any other definition, those by invoice are the people that came back to you. Now notice I said it's a recall patient, not a new patient. So we now have 2,000 patients as a stable fact of the actual active patient count in your office. Now let's divide that by 2, because they're supposed to come in twice a year as a minimum. Some people come 3 for recare if they're hygiene patients or perio patients. Some come 4, but there's an average of 2. So 2 into 2,000 hygiene visits is about 1,000 active patients. Now earlier I talked about, which you will see on this slide, we had 10,000 patients come into this office in the last 20 years. It has 5 days a week of hygiene with 1,000 active patients. What is the actual loss of patients coming into that office over a period of 20 years? And the loss, as you can see by the equation, there's 10,000 patients that came in over 20 years, and there's 1,000 active patients. The loss is 90%. So the average loss or leakage of the database in the dental industry is the largest unknown fact to long-term practice growth that exists. If you have that definition, the practice will grow. If you can increase the hygiene days, the practice will grow. Your practice throughout the years is losing 85 to 90% of its consumers every year that they walk in. Now, if you do your own math and your own practice, rather than have me do it, you'll see the reality for yourself. The next lesson is going to talk about how do you take that retention and that loss and shut the faucet off so you're not losing them.